At 2 in the morning, on an empty stretch of Westminster Avenue, beneath a cold October rain, a baton shattered the driver's window of a black Maybach with a crack as dry as a gunshot. Raymond Falcone did not shout. He placed both hands on the steering wheel, exactly the way people are taught to, and said 3 times that the registration was in the right compartment, that the car was in his name. No one bothered to open it. Deputy Chief Warren Blackwood dragged him out, twisted his arms behind his back, forced him down onto the wet asphalt, then leaned close to his ear and said something the rain almost swallowed. "Mr. Falcone, I know exactly who you are. That's the reason I'm here." And in that moment, Raymond understood that this was not a traffic stop, and it was not a mistake. The window had not been broken to search for drugs. Blackwood tore through the glove box, the seams of the seats, the trunk, slicing open the leather like a man hunting for one specific thing he already knew was there. The man whose name made an entire city lower its voice was now kneeling in the rain in handcuffs, while 6 people watched from across the street, and not one of them stepped forward. He did not look at the car being destroyed. He looked at a small object that had fallen from his coat pocket into a puddle at the edge of the road, a white-faced watch whose hands had stopped 30 years ago, at exactly 4:12. Under an awning not far away, a 71-year-old woman raised her phone with trembling hands and pressed record. And on the far side of the avenue, a young woman just off her night shift stood frozen, watching all of it, with no idea that 3 days later, something she would pick up off the floor of a records room would tear open what an entire county had kept buried for almost 30 years. That night, they believed they had humiliated a criminal. She had no idea they had just woken up the one man patient enough to wait for them to sign their own names to their downfall. If this story moves you, leave a like, and tell me where you're listening from. Someone near you might be hearing the very same story right now. Share it with someone you think needs to hear it. And subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Blackwood turned to the final page of the stack of papers from the glove compartment, then threw everything onto the wet road. He dropped to one knee, reached into the narrow space between the 2 front seats, and pulled out a pen, a charging cable, and several coins. He opened the trunk, lifted the floor mat, and rapped his knuckles against the spare tire compartment, listening to the hollow echo. Nothing. He turned to search the door pockets, tipped the leather document bag upside down, and shook it hard until sheets of paper fluttered into the puddles. Still nothing. What he needed was a thin file with a blue cover, no more than 20 pages, and he had been certain it was inside this car because someone had told him that Falcone always kept the things he valued close to him. Blackwood straightened, released a long breath, and in that moment, Raymond saw the entire truth rise across the deputy sheriff's face. It wasn't the disappointment of a man who had failed to find drugs. It was the panic of a man who had just realized he had gone too far for something that wasn't there. The rain grew heavier. Raymond remained on his knees, both shoulders soaked through, water running down the bridge of his nose and dripping onto the asphalt. He said nothing. He only watched Blackwood circle the Maybach one more time, slowly, like a man trying to decide what to do with a mistake he had already made. Then Blackwood opened the patrol car door, climbed inside, and shut it behind him. The young officer standing nearby frowned. "Boss?" No one answered. The reverse lights flared red through the rain. The engine roared, and the patrol car lurched backward, slamming directly into the front of the Maybach. The sound of metal grinding against metal tore across the empty road, stretched on, then died away. The hood of the black car sprang upward like a door kicked from its hinges. One headlight shattered. Across the street, someone let out a short cry, then fell silent. Blackwood stepped out, raised his radio, and said in a voice so calm it made the blood run cold that there had been a minor collision during the arrest, that the suspect's vehicle had rolled forward on its own and struck the patrol car, that no one had been injured, and that a tow truck was required. He released the radio button. Rainwater streamed along the brim of his hat. Raymond looked at him and understood that what Blackwood had just said wasn't an improvised lie. It had been delivered too smoothly, with timing that was too exact, like a line someone had recited many times before, on other roads, beside other cars. That was when Raymond knew he wasn't the first. His hands tightened behind his back against the cuffs. Blackwood stepped forward, hooked a hand through his elbow, and hauled him to his feet. Raymond's knees were numb, but he stood steady. Blackwood began to read, his voice rising in an even rhythm through the rain, that Raymond Falcone was under arrest on charges of resisting an officer and obstructing official duties, that he had the right to remain silent, and that anything he said could be used against him in court. Raymond listened to every word. He didn't interrupt. He didn't object. He didn't say for the fourth time that the car was registered in his name. He only turned his head to the right, very slowly, and looked toward the young officer standing motionless beside the patrol car door. He was about 24 years old, his face still boyish, one hand resting awkwardly on his belt, as though he didn't know where else to put it. He had been standing there from the beginning. He had seen everything, and he hadn't stepped forward. The two men looked at each other for roughly 3 seconds through the rain. The young officer was the first to turn away. Raymond committed that face to memory, the way the officer lifted a hand to the back of his neck and then let it fall, the way a young man searched for somewhere to hide his hands when he knew he had just done something wrong. Raymond didn't hate him. He simply remembered, the way he had remembered everything for the past 30 years. Blackwood shoved him toward the rear door of the patrol car, placed a hand on his head, and forced him down onto the seat. The door slammed shut. Inside, the car was warm and suffocating, the smell of old plastic mingling with cold coffee. Through the fogged glass, Raymond saw the Maybach one last time, its front end crushed, the windshield split wide open, both doors hanging open as rain poured onto the slashed leather seats. He searched the road once more for the small puddle near the shoulder, but from this angle he couldn't see it anymore. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes. Then he opened them and looked at the one thing he had been saving from the beginning. On Blackwood's chest, just beneath the badge, the body camera was still there. Its indicator light was dark. No green, no red, no blinking. It was off, and it had been off before Blackwood had even stepped out of his own vehicle. Raymond knew that, because when the baton struck the windshield, he had managed to glance at Blackwood's chest out of the habit of a man who had spent his whole life in a world where everyone needed to know whether they were being recorded. People didn't turn off a camera because they forgot. They turned it off when they already knew that what was about to happen shouldn't be recorded. The patrol car began to move. Raymond sat perfectly still, his hands cuffed behind his back, his wet shirt clinging to his skin, and only one thought remained in his mind, sharp and cold as a nail driven into wood. He hadn't found what he needed. That meant he would have to look somewhere else. 6 hours earlier, before the rain began, Raymond Falcone sat in his office on the 4th floor of a building bearing the name Falcone Construction in Federal Hill, and on the desk before him were 2 thick sets of documents that Maren Voss had just placed there. Voss was 38 years old, had served as his personal attorney for 6 years, and in all those 6 years, she had never brought him a piece of news she hadn't checked 3 times before opening her mouth. She pulled out the chair opposite him, sat down, opened the first file, and began to speak. She talked about 3 transportation companies that would be merged into the construction entity in the coming quarter. She talked about 2 warehouses near the harbor that would be transferred to a vetted third party. She talked about the people who would be let go with full compensation, and the people who would have to find another road for themselves. She turned to the final page and tapped one finger against a line printed in bold. 2 years, she said. Just 2 more years. And on paper there would no longer be anything connecting his name to the things people still whispered about out there. He would be nothing more than a man who owned a construction company in Rhode Island. Raymond listened to all of it without interrupting once. He had carried that habit for a long time, the habit of letting people speak until they had no words left. Because the truest part of a person was usually found in the last sentence, not the first. Only when Voss closed the file did he speak, and he asked just one question. What about the petition? Voss didn't answer at once. She reached for the second file, much thinner than the first, and pushed it across the desk. Inside was a petition stamped as received, filed 3 weeks earlier, along with a copy of a set of documents kept inside a blue cardboard cover faded with age. Voss rested her hand on that blue cover but didn't open it. "You know I already filed it," she said. "I know," Raymond replied. "But you haven't heard the rest." She drew in a breath. "It's been 3 weeks, and the county office hasn't sent back a single line. I called 4 times. The first time, they said it was being forwarded to records. The second time, they said they were waiting for the person in charge. The third time, they said I needed to submit another power of attorney, even though I included one from the beginning. The 4th time, no one answered." She paused. "Raymond, this doesn't feel like a delayed petition. It feels like a petition being pushed away." Raymond looked down at the blue cover on the desk. The late afternoon light streamed through the window and laid a long band of brightness across the wood, cutting directly through the place where the file rested. He didn't reach out to touch it. He had read every word inside so many times that he no longer needed to open it. "Do you know why I keep a copy?" he asked. Voss shook her head. "Because the original is in the county archives," he said, "and the things kept in the county archives belong to no one." Voss watched him for a long moment, then lowered her voice. "I need to tell you something plainly. For the past 2 years, you've done everything the right way. You transferred assets, you cut away what needed to be cut away, and you stayed silent when silence was necessary. No one touched you, because no one had a reason. But this petition is different. It doesn't ask for money, it doesn't ask for land, and it doesn't demand that anyone give you anything. It only asks for something that was closed a very long time ago to be opened again. And I need you to understand that in this city, money can be negotiated. But when an old record is dragged back into the light, there are people who won't negotiate at all. There are people who are going to hate this." Raymond nodded slowly. "I know," he said, "and you still want to continue." He picked up the pen, opened the petition to the final page, and signed his name on the line reserved for the petitioner, his strokes firm, without hesitation, without pausing halfway through. Then he pushed the paper back toward Voss. She looked at the signature, then at him. "You've never told me what's inside that blue cover," she said. "It's been 6 years." Raymond didn't answer. He reached up and removed the watch from his left wrist, then placed it on the desk. Its face was ivory white, its steel rim had gone dull, and the leather strap had been replaced 3 times, but the movement inside was still the original one. He took a handkerchief from his pocket and slowly wiped the crystal, moving from the center outward, twice around, exactly as he had done thousands of times before, until his hand knew what to do without thought. Voss looked at the 2 hands frozen on the watch face. They pointed to 12 minutes past 4, and they had pointed there for the entire time she had known him. "Why don't you have it repaired?" she asked. "There's a watchmaker on Hope Street who can do it. Shall I ask for you?" Raymond fastened the watch around his wrist again, closed the clasp, and pulled his sleeve down over it. He stood, picked up the car keys from the desk, and walked toward the door. Voss remained seated, waiting for an answer, but none came. Only when his hand was already resting on the doorknob did he turn back and say something entirely different. "The blue cover," he said. "Keep it in the safe at your office. Don't carry it with you. Don't leave it in your car, and don't give it to anyone, not even me, if I call and ask for it." Voss frowned. "Not even you, not even me," he replied. Then he opened the door and stepped into the hallway, and 6 hours later, beneath the October rain on Westminster Avenue, a man would tear through every corner of Raymond's car searching for that exact blue cover. Delphine Archer clocked out of the county administration building at 1:52 in the morning, and as she did every night, she walked for 10 minutes along Westminster Avenue to reach the stop for the number 27 bus. It was the final bus of the day, leaving at 2:15, and if she missed it, she had to walk 3 kilometers home. So she always moved quickly, her head lowered, one hand gripping the strap of her bag. That night it was raining, so she walked even faster. She had gone halfway when she heard the sound. It wasn't an explosion, and it wasn't a horn, but a sharp, dry crack that rang out and vanished at once, the kind of sound an ordinary person might mistake for someone dropping a crate. She stopped. Then she looked across the street and saw blue and red lights sweeping over the fronts of closed shops. 6 people were already standing there before she arrived. A middle-aged couple who had just come out of a bar, 2 young men in hooded sweatshirts, a man beside a delivery truck, and an elderly woman sheltering beneath an awning with her phone raised. Delphine was the 7th. She stood about 20 paces away beneath a street lamp, and she saw everything from beginning to end. She saw the man in the black coat kneeling on the wet road, his hands cuffed behind his back, not struggling, not shouting. She saw the officer slash open the leather seats and pull everything from the car, throwing it into the water. She saw the patrol car reverse and ram the front of the black vehicle, heard the long grind of metal against metal before it died away, and felt her own hand rise to cover her mouth. At that moment, a voice inside her spoke with perfect clarity and told her to take out her phone. She reached into her pocket. Her fingers touched it. Then she thought about the timesheets inside the county building, thought about who that building belonged to, thought about what might happen if someone reviewed the footage the next day and recognized the face of a night shift cleaner. What would happen to her hours, to next month's rent, to her younger brother asleep in a rented room 3 kilometers away? She pulled her hand from her pocket. She turned and walked away. She didn't run at first. She only walked quickly, then faster. And by the time she turned onto Broad Street, she was truly running. Running until she had no breath left, and she missed the 2:15 bus. She walked home through the rain. The entire way, she kept telling herself that she wasn't a police officer, wasn't a lawyer, wasn't anyone with authority, that 6 other people had been standing there and they had phones too, that none of this had anything to do with her. She repeated it over and over until she managed to fit the key into the lock of her second-floor room in an old row house in Olneyville. Inside, the desk lamp was still on. Tobias lay asleep on the bed against the wall, 9 years old, the library book about astronomy open face down on his chest, one finger still tucked between 2 pages, as though he had only meant to rest his eyes for a moment before continuing. The open page showed a picture of Saturn. Delphine stood in the doorway and watched him for a while. Then she gently drew the book from his hands, closed it, and placed it on the table beside a pencil and 3 sheets of scrap paper covered with uneven circles. She pulled the blanket up to his shoulders, adjusted his pillow, then reached over and switched off the lamp. In the darkness, she listened to the boy's steady breathing and felt something inside her chest loosen a little. She removed her wet coat, hung it on the hook behind the door, and sat down on the plastic chair beside the window. She intended to sit for 5 minutes and then sleep, because she had a second shift at the laundromat at 7 in the morning. But she sat there until dawn. It wasn't because of the image of the man kneeling in the rain, though that image returned every time she closed her eyes. It wasn't because of the sound of metal grinding against metal. It was because a question kept rising inside her mind and refused to lie down. Delphine knew nothing about police work, but she understood work itself. She had cleaned the county administration building for 2 years, had passed through hundreds of rooms where people sat and worked, and she knew that when someone searched for something, the way they searched revealed what they were looking for. A person searching for keys turned over cushions and ran a hand along the edge of a sofa. A person searching for money opened wallets, opened drawers, lifted rugs. But the officer that night had searched the glove compartment, dug into the gap between the seats, opened the trunk, lifted the floor mat, then turned a leather bag upside down and shook it until papers fell out. He picked up every sheet and looked at it before throwing it away. She had seen that clearly beneath the headlights. He wasn't looking for a gun. He wasn't looking for a small bag, a wrapped package, or anything that could be hidden inside a narrow space. He was turning over papers. He was looking for documents. And if he had smashed the windshield of a car in the middle of the night just to find paperwork, then that paper mattered more than the car itself. Delphine sat in the darkness, watching the streetlight spill through the window frame, and for the first time in her life she felt something very strange. It wasn't fear. It was knowing. She knew something she was never supposed to know, and there was no way to give it back anymore. The county police headquarters stood at the end of Pontiac Street, a low brick building constructed in the 1970s, and when the glass doors opened shortly before 3 in the morning, every conversation inside broke off for exactly half a beat. No one cheered. No one pointed. A man pouring coffee simply stopped with his hand suspended. Someone typing at a computer slowed his fingers, and 2 people standing beside the notice board turned their heads, then quickly looked away. Raymond Falcone crossed the lobby with both wrists cuffed behind his back, his soaked coat clinging to his shoulders, and he knew perfectly well that at least 4 people inside that building had recognized him from the very first second. Blackwood led him to the intake desk. The woman sitting behind the computer was about 50 years old, with her glasses resting low on the bridge of her nose, and she typed with 2 fingers. She looked up at him, then at Blackwood, then back at him again for longer than necessary. "New arrival," Blackwood said, resisting an officer and obstructing official duties. She asked his name. "Raymond Falcone," he answered. She typed. She asked his date of birth, and he answered. She asked his address, and he answered. She asked his occupation, and he gave her 3 words. "Civil construction work." Blackwood let out a quiet laugh through his nose. The woman didn't laugh. She finished typing, printed a sheet of paper, and told Raymond to turn around. They rolled each of his fingers across the ink pad, his thumbs first, then the other 4 fingers, rolling slowly and pressing hard, and Raymond allowed his hands to be guided by someone else, as though they were objects. They moved him to a wall marked with height measurements and told him to look directly into the camera. The flash went off twice, once from the front and once from the side. He didn't frown, didn't curl his lip, didn't do anything that might turn his face into one worth remembering. He had seen hundreds of photographs like that in his life, and he knew that people always enlarged the eyes, so he kept his own eyes empty. Afterward, they led him down a short hallway to a temporary holding cell. The iron door closed behind him, with a heavy clang that struck the concrete floor and slowly faded away. Inside were 4 gray walls, a metal bench bolted into place, and a fluorescent light that made everything look pale and exhausted. Raymond sat down on the bench. The cold metal seeped through the wet fabric of his trousers almost immediately. He leaned forward, rested both elbows on his knees, and didn't speak a single word for the next 40 minutes. He didn't call for a guard. He didn't demand a lawyer. He didn't mention any of the names that, if spoken aloud, would have been enough to change the atmosphere inside that building completely within 10 minutes. He knew exactly what he held in his hands. He simply chose not to use it. When a guard finally opened the door and told him he was allowed 1 call, Raymond stood and followed without asking another question. The telephone was mounted on the wall at the end of the hallway. He entered a number he knew by heart. It rang 3 times. Then Maren Voss answered, fully alert even though it was 3:40 in the morning, because she was the kind of lawyer who slept with her phone face down on her chest. Voss speaking. "It's me," Raymond said. She was silent for exactly 1 second. "Where are you?" "County headquarters, Pontiac Street." She asked what the charges were. He told her. She asked whether anyone had put their hands on him. He said yes. She asked whether he was hurt. He said not badly. Then she told him she would be there in 45 minutes, that she already had the number of a judge on night duty, that by morning he would be out of there, and by noon everyone in that station would be sitting down to explain themselves to someone else. Raymond let her finish. Then he said 5 words. "Don't post bail. Leave me inside." The other end of the line went completely silent. He heard her set something down. "What did you just say?" she asked. "You heard me," he replied. "Raymond," she said. And her voice dropped in the way a person's voice does when they're trying to remain calm while their mind is already screaming. "I don't know what happened tonight, but I know you're sitting in a holding cell inside a police station where you don't know anyone, after an officer just put his hands on you. Do you understand what can happen to a man like you in a place like that?" "I understand," he said. "Then why?" Raymond looked down the hallway. About 15 meters away, an officer passed by, glanced at him, then quickened his pace. Raymond lowered his voice. "Tonight he was looking for the blue cover," he said. "He searched every part of my car. He didn't find it." Raymond heard her draw in a breath. "If I'm out of here within 4 hours," he continued, "he'll know he's run out of time, and he'll stay still. He'll hire a lawyer, rewrite his report, and wait. But if he believes I'm still sitting behind bars, that I've been charged, that I'm worried about saving myself, then he'll think he still has time. And a man who thinks he still has time will go finish whatever he failed to finish tonight." Voss said nothing. "I need to know what that is," Raymond said. "There's no way to find out except by letting him do it himself." "You're turning yourself into bait," she said. "I'm turning myself into a man sitting in jail," he replied. To him, those 2 things are the same. The silence stretched for several seconds. Then Voss said, "All right, but I'm coming there. I'll register as your attorney. I'll put my name on the paperwork so no one dares do anything to you without someone knowing." "Fine," he said. "Do that, but don't pay anything." She asked whether there was anything else. Raymond looked up at the camera mounted in the corner of the hallway ceiling, its small red light still glowing, then spoke his final sentence slowly and clearly. "Hold on to the blue cover. Don't let it leave the safe for even 1 minute." Then he hung up. At 4:10 in the morning, Warren Blackwood sat at a computer at the far end of the shared workroom, wearing a fresh shirt, his hair still damp, and typed his report with 2 fingers, in the steady rhythm of a man who had written the same kind of document over and over for nearly 20 years. He wrote that at 2:07 in the morning, while patrolling the Westminster route, he observed a vehicle traveling at an inconsistent speed and decided to conduct a traffic stop. He wrote that the driver refused to cooperate, failed to comply with commands to exit the vehicle, appeared agitated, and reached toward an area outside the officer's line of sight, forcing him to break the door to gain access for safety reasons. He wrote that the search of the vehicle's interior was conducted on the basis of reasonable suspicion and that no prohibited items were found. He wrote that during the restraint of the suspect, the vehicle rolled forward and made contact with the patrol car, causing minor damage to both vehicles, with no injuries reported. Then he paused for a moment, rested both hands on the keyboard, and typed the final line. stating that the officer's body-worn recording device experienced a technical malfunction during the incident and requesting an inspection by the technical department. He read the report once from beginning to end. He corrected 2 spelling errors. Then he pressed print. The printer in the corner hummed in the nearly empty room, and Blackwood rose, collected the 3 warm sheets of paper, clipped them together, and carried them down the hallway to the office of the sergeant on duty. Hollis Drake was 57 years old, had served in the department for 30 years, and during those 30 years he had approved more reports than the number of nights he had slept a full night. He took the 3 pages, lowered his glasses, and began to read. He read the first line, the second, the third. Then he reached the name of the man who had been arrested, and he stopped. Blackwood stood across from the desk with both hands in his pockets, waiting. The sergeant didn't look up at once. He read the name a second time, more slowly, as though making certain that his eyes weren't betraying him at 4:20 in the morning. When he finally raised his head, the color had drained from his face. It wasn't the red of anger. It was the white of a man who had just lost blood. "Who did you stop?" he asked. "You read it," Blackwood replied. Drake placed the report on the desk, and Blackwood saw that his fingers trembled slightly as he did it. "Do you know who that is?" Drake asked. "I know," Blackwood said. "You knew, and you still stopped him." "I knew, and I still stopped him." Drake sank back into his chair. He raised a hand to his face, dragged his palm from his forehead down to his chin, and left it there for a while. The only sound in the room was the ventilation fan in the ceiling. Blackwood remained still, offering no further explanation and asking no questions, and it was that calmness that made the sergeant lift his head and look at him in an entirely different way. "Do you understand what's coming?" Drake said. "I'm not talking about him suing. Men like him don't sue. I'm talking about people looking into this department from now on. Not at you. At this department." "I know," Blackwood said. "You don't know," Drake replied, his voice suddenly sharpening before dropping again as though even he had been startled by its volume. He picked up the report once more and tapped a fingertip against the final line, the one about the recording device. "This," he said. "You wrote that it was a technical malfunction." "That's right," Blackwood said. Drake stared at him for a long time. Not because he didn't believe him, because he was calculating. He was calculating how many hands that sentence would pass through, how many filing cabinets it would sit inside, and how long it would be before someone with enough time opened it and compared it against something else. Then he set the paper down and told Blackwood something he had said to no fewer than a dozen young officers over the course of his career, but never once in the voice he used that night. "Listen to me," he said. "From this moment forward, you don't change one word in these 3 pages. Not one sentence. One word. People are going to ask you about this at least 4 times over the next 6 months, and every time, you have to tell it exactly the same way. Because if the second version differs from the first, even if all you do is change rolled to drifted, they won't conclude that you remembered it wrong. They'll conclude that you lied the first time, and once they believe you lied once, everything you've ever signed your name to becomes something worth opening and examining again." Blackwood nodded. "My story won't change," he said. "Good," Drake replied. Then he picked up his pen, signed the approval box, signed quickly without reading the report again, and pushed the pages aside as though they were hot. Blackwood took his copy and walked out. The door closed behind him. Drake remained seated for roughly half a minute. Then he stood, took his coat, and walked to the parking lot behind the building. A light rain was still falling. He stood beneath the metal roof over the parking area, pulled a pack of cigarettes from his coat pocket, and had to strike the lighter 3 times before the flame caught. He smoked the entire cigarette in 4 long drags, staring out across the wet lot, and his hand trembled through all 4 of them. It wasn't from the cold. He had stood in that parking lot for 30 years, and he had never felt cold there. He dropped the cigarette butt into a puddle, watched it go dark, then pulled out a second one. He wasn't thinking about Blackwood. He wasn't thinking about the man sitting in a holding cell 40 meters away. He was thinking about something else. Something that had lain still for 30 years and had shifted tonight. And he told himself, so quietly that the words never became sound, that this had nothing to do with that. He said it 3 times. By the 3rd time, the cigarette in his hand had burned halfway down, and he hadn't taken a single drag. At 6 in the morning, in the kitchen of a small house in Elmwood, Ruth Ann Collier sat in front of the desktop computer her granddaughter had set up for her 4 years earlier, and she had been sitting there for nearly an hour without clicking anything. She was 71 years old and had worked as a nurse in the emergency department for 34 years before retiring. And in those 34 years, she had seen nearly everything human beings were capable of doing to one another. She had believed there was nothing left that could make her hands tremble. But the night before, when she stood beneath the awning of the closed drugstore and raised her phone, her hand shook so badly that she had to brace her elbow against the wall to keep the image steady. She had watched the recording 7 times since returning home. 7 times she saw the man kneeling on the road without making a sound. 7 times she saw the arm rise and come down. 7 times she heard the glass break. And 7 times she put the phone down and told herself that she was too old for this. She said it aloud in the empty kitchen. "You're 71 years old, Ruth Ann." She said that she lived alone, that her husband had been dead for 9 years, that all she had was this house and her pension, that people could do many things to an old woman living by herself without anyone noticing. She said this was police business, but what happened last night had been done by the police, so it belonged to someone above them, and she didn't know anyone above them. She stood and made a pot of tea. She poured herself a cup. She sat down again. Then she closed her eyes, and the sound of breaking glass rang through her mind once more, dry and abrupt, exactly as she had heard it in the rain, and this time she remembered one detail she had missed during all 7 viewings. In the recording, 6 other people were standing across the street. No one stepped forward. Neither had she. She had only stood there and held up her phone, and if she deleted it now, then last night would become a night when nothing had happened at all. She placed her hand on the mouse. Her finger was still trembling. She opened the social media page her granddaughter had created, so she could look at pictures of her great-grandchildren. The page she had used for 4 years only to click like and write things such as "so beautiful" or "grandma loves you." She clicked the box to create a post. She uploaded the recording and sat watching the progress bar move slowly across the screen. Then she began to type, pecking out 1 letter at a time, reading each sentence twice before continuing. She wrote that she had witnessed this on Westminster Avenue at 2 o'clock that morning. She wrote that the man hadn't resisted at all, that he had remained kneeling quietly from beginning to end. She wrote that she didn't know who he was, and didn't need to know, because whether what she had seen the night before was right or wrong didn't depend on who he was. She wrote that she had stood there and done nothing but record because she hadn't known what else to do. She looked at those words for a long time. Then she clicked post. For the first 15 minutes, nothing happened. 12 views. She stood, washed her teacup, wiped the table, and fed the cat. When she returned, the number had risen to 400. She put on her glasses so she could see clearly. 400. She refreshed the page. 1,200. She sat down and didn't stand again. By 9 in the morning, the number was 15,000. By noon, 200,000. But it wasn't the number that sent a chill down her spine. It was the comments. She scrolled down and saw them divide into 2 distinct halves, like 2 currents of water refusing to merge. One half said that what had happened was unacceptable, that someone had to answer for it, that they thanked her for being brave. The other half contained words that made her remove her glasses. People asked whether she knew who she had just recorded. They wrote the name Falcone alongside stories she had never heard, wrote that the man deserved it, that someone had finally dared to touch him, that this old woman should learn who she was defending. Someone asked where she lived. Ruth Ann sat completely still. She had thought people would either thank her or condemn her, one or the other. She hadn't imagined both happening at once, and she certainly hadn't imagined that the same recording, the same man kneeling in the rain, could make thousands of people see 2 entirely different stories. Then the landline mounted on the kitchen wall began to ring. She flinched. It rang 8 times and stopped. 30 seconds later it rang again. This time she stood, walked over, placed her hand on the receiver, and remained that way until the ringing stopped. It rang a 3rd time, then a 4th. Ruth Ann Collier stepped backward, sat down in the chair beside the window, and didn't answer. The following night, at 10 o'clock, Delphine Archer's phone vibrated with a message from Marguerite, the woman who worked the night shift on the same crew, saying that she had a fever and asking whether Delphine could cover for her. Delphine answered yes within 10 seconds because a replacement shift paid an extra quarter of the regular wage, and because she was still $160 short on this month's rent. She thought nothing more about it. She only sent a message to the woman downstairs, asking her to keep an eye on the room and check whether Tobias was asleep, then walked to the bus stop. What she didn't know and had no possible way of knowing, was that inside the county administration building, the night shift assignment sheet was printed at 5 o'clock every afternoon and posted in the security room, and that evening's sheet still listed Marguerite Delacroix for the basement and records storage areas. No one corrected it. No one thought it needed to be corrected. Delphine arrived at 11 o'clock, changed into her uniform, collected her cart from the supply room, and began working as she did every night. She cleaned the second floor first, then the first, then went down to the basement. The record storage area stood at the end of a long underground corridor, where 14 rows of gray steel filing cabinets were arranged like low walls, and the smell was always the same, old paper mingled with dampness, and the faint scent of metal dust. She had cleaned that place for 2 years. She knew every hollow in the tiled floor, knew which cabinet had a wheel that jammed, and even knew about the light above the 9th row that flickered. But that night, when she pushed her cart out of the service elevator at 3:28 in the morning, something was different. The corridor was dark. Not completely dark, but only the row of pale yellow emergency lights along the base of the walls remained on, while every ceiling light had been switched off. Delphine stopped. She looked toward the breaker box mounted on the wall to her left, a box she had never seen anyone open, and saw that its cover was resting slightly ajar. Her first thought was a local power failure. Her second was to notify security. Then she heard the sound. A low, steady mechanical hum, broken by short, strained growls. The sound of a machine chewing through something, stopping, then chewing again. Delphine knew that sound. It was the industrial paper shredder at the far end of the records room. The machine people used for roughly 15 minutes once a week during the day. She remained still for about 5 seconds. Then, instead of returning to the elevator, she pushed her cart forward several more steps, slowly and quietly, until she could see inside through the open doorway. A man stood beside the 4th row of cabinets. He wasn't wearing a uniform. He wore a dark wool coat and jeans, with no gloves on his hands. And beneath the emergency lighting, he looked like anyone searching for something in a storage room. The drawer in front of him had been pulled all the way open, and a stack of files already removed from it rested on top of the cabinet beside him. He took each file, pulled out the metal fastener and threw it into a box, then fed the papers into the mouth of the shredder. He did it with practiced skill, neither hurried nor clumsy, like a man who had calculated exactly how much time he would need. Delphine stepped backward. She pushed the cart into the darkness between the wall and the large electrical cabinet in the corridor, crouched behind it, and stayed there. From that position, she could still see inside through the gap between the cart's 2 wheels. She saw the man's face when he turned to collect the next stack of papers, and she recognized him at once, without needing even a second to be certain, because the night before she had seen that same face beneath the patrol car headlights on Westminster Avenue. Her heart pounded so hard that she could hear it inside her ears. She covered her mouth with one hand, not because she was about to cry out, but because she was afraid of the sound of her own breathing. She looked up at the sign fixed to the end of the 4th row, its printed letters set against yellowed plastic, and she read 3 words: labor-related cases. Beneath them was a range of years, from 1990 to 2000. The man destroyed the entire first stack, then returned to the cabinet for more. The machine ran, stopped, ran again. Delphine remained behind the cart for 14 minutes. She knew it was exactly 14 minutes because she watched the red digital clock mounted on the opposite wall, watched it constantly, and remembered that it read 3:31 when it began, and 3:45 when he finally closed the drawer. During those 14 minutes, he stopped once and turned his head toward the doorway. He stood motionless, tilted his head, and listened. Delphine didn't breathe. She felt sweat running down her spine even though the basement was cold. He looked in her direction for roughly 4 seconds, then turned back to his work. At 3:45, he switched off the machine, pushed the drawer closed, slid the lock into place, then bent down to gather the metal fasteners and put them into the pocket of his coat. He walked out. His footsteps passed less than 2 meters from where she was hiding. She heard the service elevator doors open and close. Then she heard the elevator motor carry him upward. Then silence. Delphine remained crouched for roughly 3 more minutes before she could stand, and when she rose, both her knees felt weak. She stepped into the records room. The air smelled of hot paper and the faint scent of scorched plastic from the shredder motor. The bin beneath the machine was nearly half full of twisted strips of paper, tangled together so tightly that not a single word could still be read. She stood before the fourth row of cabinets and looked at the sign once more to be certain. Then she looked down at the floor. Beneath the cabinet, the corner of a white sheet of paper protruded by roughly the length of 2 finger joints. She knelt, slipped her hand underneath, and pulled it out. It was a large sheet, yellowed around the edges and folded once across the middle, and it had probably fallen when the man removed the stack of records from the drawer. Delphine opened it beneath the emergency light. At the top of the page was the name of a construction company she had never heard of. Beneath it was a ruled table, and inside that table was a list of names arranged in rows, with several numbers and abbreviations beside each one that she didn't understand. She counted 7 rows. At the bottom of the page was a box showing a job title and a handwritten signature in blue ink, a twisting scrawl she couldn't decipher, and in the upper right corner, stamped with a faded rubber seal, was a date. April 12th, 1996. Delphine read the paper 3 times. She didn't understand what it said. She didn't know who the 7 names belonged to, didn't know what the numbers meant, and didn't know whose signature appeared at the bottom. She was a cleaner, not a lawyer, and at that moment all she held was an old sheet of paper stained with dust. But there was one thing she understood with absolute clarity, so clearly that her fingers tightened around the edge of the page. No one went into a basement at 3 o'clock in the morning, without a uniform, without turning on the lights, without notifying security, to destroy a stack of records that were 30 years old, unless there was something inside them worth hiding. She folded the sheet into quarters and slipped it inside the lining of her coat. Then she pushed her cart back into the corridor, finished cleaning the basement until the end of her shift, and worked with hands that trembled so badly she had to wring out the cloth 3 times because it kept slipping from her grasp. During the 3 days, Raymond Falcone sat in the holding cell on Pontiac Street. Maren Voss barely went home. She registered as his defense attorney on the very first night, placed her name on every page where a name could be placed, and she did it not for the sake of procedure, but because she wanted everyone who passed through that hallway to know that the man inside that cell had a name attached to him, and that name would ask questions if anything happened. The next morning, she arrived at the county administration office at 9 o'clock, just as the doors opened. She stood in line behind 3 people, then sat before a glass counter and passed a copy of the stamped receipt for the petition filed 3 weeks earlier through the opening beneath the window. She said she wanted to know its processing status. The woman behind the counter typed for about half a minute, stopped, typed again, then looked up and said in a flat voice that the requested record was currently unavailable for retrieval. Voss asked what unavailable for retrieval meant. The woman said that according to a note in the system, the original documents had been lost during the archival process. Voss remained silent for several seconds. Then she asked who had entered that note. The woman said she wasn't authorized to provide that information. Voss asked on what date the note had been entered into the system. The woman looked at the screen, hesitated, then read out a date. Voss thanked her, stood, walked out of the building, and only when she reached the sidewalk did she take out her phone and open the calendar. She looked at the date she had just heard. Then she looked at the date Raymond had been stopped on Westminster Avenue. The 2 dates were less than 24 hours apart, and the date reporting the file missing came afterward. Voss stood beneath the harsh sunlight on the sidewalk and felt a chill travel down her spine. During her 6 years as Raymond Falcone's personal attorney, she had learned one thing he repeated without ever explaining, that the most frightening thing in any record wasn't what had been written, but the order in which it had been written. People could lie about content. It was much harder to lie about dates because the system stamped those automatically, and the order here was perfectly clear. First, a petition had been filed. Then came 3 weeks of silence. Then a car was stopped in the middle of the night, and a man tore through every compartment inside it, searching for documents. Then, on the very next day, the original version of those same documents was recorded as missing from the county archives. Voss returned to her car, sat behind the wheel, and remained there for a long time without starting the engine. Over the next 2 days, she did 3 things. She filed a request for a copy of the arrest report and received a response stating that the record was undergoing internal review. She filed a request for footage from the body-worn camera of the officer who made the arrest and received a response stating that the device had been transferred to the technical department because of a hardware failure. And she requested a telephone conversation with her client outside regular visiting hours, something she had done dozens of times in dozens of other places and had never once been denied. This time, 3 different people denied her 3 times in succession, each offering a different reason, and none of those reasons violated policy. That was precisely what caught her attention. People didn't need to break the law to stop someone. They only needed to enforce it very strictly, very correctly, and very slowly. By the afternoon of the third day, when she was finally allowed into the visitation room, Voss carried in her briefcase a sheet of paper with 3 short handwritten lines arranged in exact chronological order, and she placed it on the metal table before Raymond without saying a word. He had grown thinner in 3 days. The bruise along his cheekbone had faded to a sickly yellow, but he still sat with his back straight, both hands resting on the table, and he lowered his eyes to read the 3 lines slowly from top to bottom. Petition filed September 19th. Vehicle stopped on the night of October 11th. Original record reported missing October 12th. He finished reading. Then he closed his eyes. He remained that way for about 5 seconds without moving, and Voss said nothing, because she had learned that when Raymond Falcone closed his eyes, it wasn't from exhaustion. It was because he was placing every piece where it belonged. She saw his jaw move once. When he opened his eyes, something in them was entirely different from what had been there when he entered the room. He didn't find it in the car, Raymond said. No, Voss replied. So he went looking somewhere else. Yes. Raymond placed one finger on the 3rd line of the paper. Do you understand what this means? He asked. It means the original was destroyed, Voss said. Not only that, he replied. It means the blue cover in your safe is no longer a copy. It's the only one left in the world. Voss felt her throat go dry. She opened her mouth to say something, but Raymond continued, his voice still quiet, still even, though 1 beat slower. And it means he finished what he hadn't finished that night, he said, while I was sitting in here, exactly as I needed him to. He raised his eyes to her. I've spent the past 3 days in this cell waiting for him to take one more step on his own. He just took it. From this point on, another day in here won't gain us anything, while the blue cover is sitting alone inside a safe and I'm still here. He pushed the paper back toward her. Post my bail, he said. Raymond Falcone walked out of the building on Pontiac Street late in the afternoon of the 3rd day, signed 3 sheets of paper, and received his wallet, his keys, and his white-faced watch inside a sealed plastic bag. He stood on the front steps, opened the bag, fastened the watch around his left wrist, and closed the clasp before taking the first step down. Voss was waiting in the car below. On the way back, she asked what he wanted to do first, and he answered with 3 words. The records archive. She said she had already requested the surveillance footage from there, and that they were arranging a time. Raymond shook his head. Don't waste time on the cameras, he said. You'll be told that the system was under maintenance that night, or that the signal failed, or that the footage was overwritten automatically. Voss asked how he could be so certain. He said that a man who turned off the camera on his chest before stepping out of his car would never allow an image of himself to remain in a basement. Men like that always worry about being seen. The problem is that they only worry about what machines can see. Voss asked what else there was. Raymond looked out the window for a while, then said, The work schedule. The basement wasn't a place without people that night. Every place has to be cleaned by someone. He would never think of that because, in his mind, the people who cleaned weren't people at all. They were part of the building, like the elevator or the water heater. 2 days later, one of Raymond's men brought back a copy of the county administration building's night shift schedule for that week. Under the basement and records storage area, only one name appeared, Marguerite Delacroix. Raymond read it, nodded, and told them to find her. They found her that afternoon. Marguerite was 62 years old, lived alone in an apartment in Silver Lake, and opened the door wearing a scarf around her neck, her voice still hoarse from fever. She said she hadn't been in the building that night. She said she had been sick, and had sent a message to the crew supervisor, and the supervisor had told her to find someone to cover the shift herself. She said she had messaged a young woman on the same crew. Raymond's men asked for the young woman's name. Marguerite hesitated, looked at the 2 strangers standing outside her home, and said she didn't want to cause trouble for anyone. It took another 40 minutes, an honest explanation, and a promise that nothing would happen to the young woman's job before she finally gave them one name, Delphine. She couldn't remember the last name. She only remembered that the girl was young, worked 2 jobs, and had a younger brother. Raymond's men returned, and after hearing everything, Raymond asked only one question. Was the work schedule corrected after the shift was changed? The answer was no. No one corrected it. No one printed a new one. The schedule posted in the security room all week still showed the name Marguerite Delacroix. Raymond sat in silence for a long time after hearing that. Then he said softly, almost to himself, that Blackwood would have read the same schedule. He was right. While Raymond was following his trail in one direction, Warren Blackwood was following it in the opposite one. That morning, Blackwood stopped by the county administration building, traded a few jokes with the elderly security guard in the lobby, then casually photographed the shift schedule posted on the security room wall. He looked at the basement assignment, Marguerite Delacroix. He remembered that during that night, he had stopped once because he thought he heard a sound in the corridor, and he had turned his head toward the doorway for 4 seconds before deciding that he had imagined it. He didn't entirely believe that conclusion, so he had someone look into Marguerite Delacroix, 62 years old, living alone in Silver Lake. He spent the next 2 full days watching a woman sick in bed who had never set foot in that basement. 2 days. Exactly the same amount of time Raymond needed to move from the work schedule to Marguerite's apartment. There was only one difference. Raymond arrived first, and he asked the right question. Blackwood arrived later, and it hadn't yet occurred to him that the name printed on the paper and the person who had actually held the cleaning cloth that night might not be the same. In Blackwood's line of work, that distance was called being 1 step behind. In Raymond's line of work, it had another name. It was called opportunity. At 4 o'clock the following afternoon, Delphine Archer was arranging baskets of folded laundry on the shelves at the laundromat on Manton Street when she looked up and saw 2 men standing outside the glass door. They didn't come in. They only stood there, one leaning against a lamppost, the other looking inside through the glass covered with lettering, and both of them wore dark coats on an afternoon that wasn't cold enough to require coats. She lowered her head and continued folding. She folded 3 towels before her hands began to tremble. She thought about the sheet of paper folded into quarters, hidden inside the lining of the coat hanging behind the door of her rented room. She thought about the fact that the owner had gone home at 3 o'clock, and that she was now alone in the laundromat. She thought about the back door leading into the alley. She set the towel down, walked straight to the rear of the building, and stood there with one hand resting on the doorknob for 2 full minutes without opening it, because it suddenly occurred to her that if they already knew where she worked, they probably knew where she lived as well, and running home would be the most foolish thing she could do. She returned to the counter. The 2 men were gone. But at 5 o'clock, when she pulled down the metal shutter and locked it, a black car was parked across the street about 30 meters away, and a man stepped out from the driver's seat. Only one man. He didn't walk toward her. He went to the wooden bench at the bus stop about 10 paces from where she stood, sat down at the far end, placed both hands on his knees, and looked out at the road. Delphine froze with the keys still in her hand. She recognized him immediately. She had seen that face twice before. Once beneath the rain on Westminster Avenue when he was kneeling in the street, and once in the recording that hundreds of thousands of people had watched. She didn't move. "You can stay right where you are," Raymond said without turning his head. "I won't stand up. You can leave whenever you choose." She didn't leave. She didn't come any closer either. She remained where she was, her back against the locked shutter, squeezing the keys so tightly that their teeth pressed into her palm. "The 2 men you saw earlier work for me," Raymond continued. "I told them to come and see whether you were here. I didn't tell them to stand there that long. That was my mistake, and I'm sorry." Delphine didn't answer. "My name is Raymond Falcone," he said. "I know who you are," she replied. Her voice was dry and higher than usual. Then she added something she hadn't intended to say, because over the past 3 days she had read too many things online, and those things had remained lodged inside her mind. "You're a criminal." Raymond nodded slowly, still looking toward the street. "Yes," he said. "Some of what people write about me is false. Some of it is true. I'm not going to sit here and try to convince you that I'm a good man, because I'm not, and because you have no reason to believe me." He fell silent for a moment, then continued. "But the man who went into the basement at 3 o'clock in the morning, turned off the corridor lights, wore no uniform, and fed 20 files into a paper shredder was a police officer. Whom you choose to believe is entirely up to you." Delphine felt the blood drain from her face. "How do you know?" she asked. "I don't know whether you saw anything," he said. "I only know that someone was cleaning down there that night. And I know the name on the work schedule wasn't yours. I found Marguerite first. She was sick, and she didn't want to talk. It took a long time before she finally gave me your name, and she only did it after I promised that nothing would happen to your job. I've kept that promise." He turned his head and looked at her for the first time. "But there's something you need to know," he said. If I was able to read that work schedule, then he was able to read it too. And that schedule still has Marguerite's name on it. So right now, he's watching a 62-year-old woman lying sick in bed. Not you. But that won't last forever. When he discovers that she wasn't there that night, he'll ask the same question I asked. Delphine remained still. Out on the road, a bus passed and disappeared from sight. What was he looking for in the car that night? She asked. Raymond looked slightly surprised, and she saw it pass across his face for the briefest fraction of a second. Why are you asking that? He said. Because I was there, she replied. I was standing across the street. I was the seventh person. I saw him search the glove compartment, then open the trunk, then shake the leather bag until the papers fell out. He picked up every sheet and looked at it. Someone searching for drugs doesn't do that. He was looking for documents. I've been thinking about it for 3 nights, and I haven't been able to sleep. Raymond looked at her for a long time. Then he answered, and he spoke plainly, without evasion and without hiding a single word. He was looking for a file with a blue cover, he said. Inside it was a copy of an old document. 3 weeks ago, I filed a petition with the county, asking them to reopen a case from 1996, and I included that copy. He thought I kept it in my car. He didn't find it. So the following night, he went into the basement and destroyed the original that the county had been storing. He paused. Now there's only 1 copy left in the world, and it's inside my lawyer's safe. What kind of case? Delphine asked. A scaffolding collapse at a construction site, Raymond said. She raised a hand to her mouth. Not from horror. It was because she had just remembered the 3 words printed on the yellowed plastic sign at the beginning of the 4th row of cabinets in the basement. The row where the man had stood and pulled the drawer all the way open. Labor-related cases. Delphine remained motionless for another 10 seconds. Then she did something she would never be able to explain afterward, no matter how many times she told the story. She walked toward him, not 10 paces, but 8. And then she stopped and reached inside her coat pocket, drawing out a sheet of paper folded into quarters, the creases worn and wrinkled from being handled again and again. This fell underneath the cabinet, she said. I picked it up after he left. I don't understand what it says. Raymond reached out and took it. He opened it and began to read. Delphine stood there watching him, and she saw no change in his face. Not a single muscle moved. He didn't frown, didn't narrow his eyes, didn't part his lips. He simply read from top to bottom once, then read it a second time more slowly. But she looked down. His left hand, the hand holding the lower edge of the paper, had tightened until his knuckles stood out white beneath the skin, and the edge of the page bent downward beneath the pressure. He held it that way for a long time. Then he looked up, and his voice remained so ordinary that it sent a chill through her. Did you read the 7 names in this table? He asked. Yes, Delphine said, but I don't know who any of them are. Raymond placed 1 finger on the 4th line from the top. This man, he said, was my father. Delphine sat down at the opposite end of the bench. She couldn't remember when she had decided to sit. Raymond smoothed the sheet of paper across his knees and began reading each line aloud, not for her sake, but like a man checking something he had known for a long time to make certain it was still there, unchanged. The first line held a Portuguese name, 39 years old. The second, an Irish name, 51 years old. The third, 23 years old. And Raymond paused for 1 beat at that number. The fourth, Salvatore Falcone, 47 years old. The fifth, the sixth, the seventh. Beside each name was a column listing a job title, another showing a worker identification number, and a final column containing only 2 abbreviations repeated exactly the same way, 7 times. At the bottom was a printed title box, marked Construction Site Safety Supervisor, and inside it was a signature in faded blue ink. In the upper right corner, a blurred rubber stamp bore the date April 12th, 1996. My father worked as a longshoreman at the harbor for 17 years, Raymond said. Then the harbor made cuts, and he started working on scaffolding for a subcontractor. He didn't know the trade. All he knew was that it paid $2 more an hour. I was 6 years old then. Delphine said nothing. From the nights she had spent working at the laundromat, she had learned that sometimes the kindest thing one person could do for another was remain silent at the right moment. They told my mother that evening, Raymond continued. She went to the hospital with someone from the company. I stayed home with the neighbor. When she came back, she carried a paper bag with his belongings inside. There was his wallet, his keys, and this watch. He didn't raise his wrist. He didn't look down at it. He simply continued in the same voice. The crystal had a crack running across it. The hands had stopped at 12 minutes past 4. They told my mother that was the time the scaffolding collapsed. She kept it in a drawer for 10 years, then gave it to me on my 16th birthday. She said she didn't need to remember that time anymore because she remembered it every day, and I had been too young then to remember anything at all, so I was the one who needed to keep it. He paused. I've replaced the strap 3 times. I've never had the watch repaired. It was the only moment in the entire conversation when his voice sank, and it sank so slightly that Delphine wouldn't have noticed if she hadn't been sitting 2 paces away. She looked down at her hands, resting on her knees. Then an image from that rainy night suddenly returned to her with such clarity that it stole her breath. She had stood beneath the street lamp across the road and watched this man kneel on the wet pavement while his car was destroyed before his eyes. She had wondered why he wasn't looking at the car. She had seen him turn his head to one side and keep staring at a place near the edge of the road, and she had thought perhaps he couldn't bear to watch what was happening and had looked away. Now she knew what had been there. "You were looking at the puddle," she said. Raymond turned toward her. "What did you say?" "That night," she said. "You weren't looking at the car. You were looking down at the puddle near the roadside. I saw you. I kept wondering why." Raymond was silent for several seconds. Then he said, "It fell from my coat pocket when they dragged me out of the car. I could buy another car. I couldn't replace that." Delphine nodded slowly. She looked at the sheet of paper on his knees, at the 7 names arranged in careful rows inside the ruled table, and asked her next question in a quieter voice. "You said you filed a petition to reopen this case. Does that mean no one has done anything for 30 years? "They did," Raymond said. "They reached a conclusion, paid compensation, and closed the case within 3 days. 3 days, Delphine repeated. 3 days, he said. My mother received some money. It wasn't much, but to us back then, it was something. She signed a paper she hadn't read all the way through because her English wasn't good. That paper said it was an isolated workplace accident caused by the worker's own negligence, and that the person accepting the payment had no further claims." He looked straight ahead at the road. "For 30 years, I believed that paper," he said. "I grew up believing my father climbed onto a scaffold, made a mistake, and fell. I believed it was something that belonged only to my family. And now?" Delphine asked. Raymond raised the paper. "Now I'm holding a table with 7 names," he said. 7 people, at the same construction site, on the same day. Delphine didn't understand at once. She looked at the paper, then at him. 7 people could still have died in the same collapse, she said. It could still have been an accident. "Yes," Raymond said. "But listen carefully to this part." He slowed his words, speaking one at a time. "The official record of the 1996 case, the record kept by the county, the record my mother signed, the record every newspaper repeated at the time, states that the accident that day had 1 victim. 1. Delphine sat perfectly still. She heard the traffic in the street, the sound of a metal shutter being pulled down somewhere at the end of the block, and the rush of blood inside her ears. She looked at the sheet of paper in the hands of the man sitting 2 paces away, the paper she had pulled from beneath a steel cabinet in the basement 3 nights earlier with 2 dust-stained fingers, the paper she had nearly left behind because she hadn't understood what it said. "And the other 6, she said. "The other 6, Raymond replied. "Their names don't appear in any public record. They weren't in the newspapers. They weren't in the official report. 6 families, 30 years, and not one person ever knocked on their doors." He slipped the paper into the inside pocket of his coat and fastened the button again. "You asked me why someone had to go into that basement at 3 o'clock in the morning, he said. "This is the answer. Not because 1 man died, because 6 people had their names erased." On Thursday morning, Raymond Falcone drove to an unmarked office building in Pawtucket, parked in the basement garage, and took the elevator to the 6th floor at exactly 9 o'clock. He had come there on this day of the month, at this hour of the day, for the past 2 years, never early, never late. The woman at the reception desk didn't ask his name. She only picked up the internal phone, said 3 words, then nodded toward the door at the end of the hallway. Inside was a small room with a wooden table, 3 chairs, a recording device, and a 52-year-old man named Arden Wolfe, a federal prosecutor who had sat across from Raymond 23 times over the past 2 years and had never once shaken his hand. That was the first thing they had agreed upon. No handshakes. No idle conversation. No meetings anywhere outside this room. And there was one more condition, written in 3 lines on page 7 of the agreement, stating that any contact outside the regular schedule would be considered a violation and could result in the cancellation of the entire immunity agreement. Wolf had read those 3 lines aloud to Raymond on the first day, and he had added that he included them not to make things difficult, but because if a man like Raymond were allowed to call a federal prosecutor whenever he wished, sooner or later that call would be used for something else. Raymond had signed, and during the 3 days he sat in the holding cell on Pontiac Street, when a single phone call could have thrown that entire building into chaos, he didn't call. Not because of pride, because if he called, the agreement would collapse, and with it the 2 years he had spent dismantling, one link at a time, the world into which he had been born. Wolf sat down, opened his notebook, and said the same thing he said every time. Begin. Raymond didn't begin. He placed a sheet of paper folded into quarters on the table. Wolf looked at it but didn't reach for it. I saw the recording, he said. The whole country saw it. I also know you spent 3 days in there. I'll be honest with you. I sat here wondering whether you were going to call me, and I'm glad you didn't. So am I, Raymond said. Wolf tapped the tip of his pen against the notebook. But I know you came here today to talk about that, he said. So let me speak first and save us both some time. The way you were treated on Westminster Avenue is a matter for the state courts, your attorney, and perhaps a civil rights unit if someone decides there are sufficient grounds. It isn't the concern of this table. This table is where you provide the information you agreed to provide. It isn't where you come to collect a debt. I understand, Raymond said. No, I don't think you do, Wolf replied, his voice hardening. I've done this work for 26 years. Do you know how many times I've sat here listening to someone on the other side bring me a file and call it justice, when what they really wanted was to use my badge to do something they couldn't conveniently do themselves? He looked directly at Raymond. You want me to bring down 2 police officers to repay a rainy night and a ruined car? Don't you? Raymond didn't answer at once. He reached out, unfolded the paper, smoothed it flat across the wooden table, and turned it so the man opposite him could read it properly. Then he pushed it toward Arden Wolf. Not 2 police officers, he said. 7 people. Wolf lowered his eyes. He read the first line. He read the second. He reached out and pulled the paper closer, and Raymond saw his fingertips stop over the final column, the one containing only 2 abbreviations repeated 7 times. He read the title box at the bottom of the page. He read the signature. Then he read the date stamped in the upper right corner, and he straightened in his chair. Where did this come from? Wolf asked. From beneath a filing cabinet in the records storage area of the county administration building, Raymond said. At 3:45 in the morning on October 12th, a cleaner found it after the man who had stopped my car the night before left the building. He entered through the service access, wore civilian clothes, shut off the corridor lights, and fed roughly 20 files into a paper shredder. This fell out, and he didn't realize it. Wolf said nothing. The cleaner's name wasn't on the work schedule that night, Raymond continued. She agreed to cover the shift at 10 o'clock that evening. No one corrected the schedule. That is the only reason she was there, and the only reason I'm sitting here with this paper instead of sitting here empty-handed. Wolf placed his pen on the table. Do you know whose signature this is? He asked. I have a suspicion, Raymond said. I won't say it until you verify it yourself, because if I say it first, someone will later claim that I invented the story. Wolf was silent. He remained silent so long that the ticking of the clock on the wall became distinct inside the room. He looked at the paper, then at Raymond, then back at the paper. Do you understand what this means if it's genuine? He finally said. I know what it means to 6 families whose doors no one ever knocked on, Raymond replied. What it means to you, you understand better than I do. Wolf stood and walked to the window. He remained there for about half a minute, both hands resting on his hips, his back turned. Then he turned, returned to the table, pulled out his chair, and sat down. He opened his notebook to a blank page, removed the cap from his pen, and said 3 words. Start from the beginning. 3 days later, when Delphine Archer arrived at the county administration building for her shift, the crew supervisor called her aside in a corner of the lobby and told her that beginning that week, the basement and record storage areas would be handled by another contractor. She asked where she would be working instead. He said there wasn't an opening for her at the moment. She asked when there would be one. He said he would let her know. She asked whether she had done something wrong, and the supervisor looked down at the clipboard in his hands and said the decision had come from above, that he had only received the notice, and that he was very sorry. He said all three things without looking at her once. Delphine walked out of the building and stood on the sidewalk for about 5 minutes. There were no grand thoughts in her mind. Only numbers. The night shift at the county building paid $320 a week. The laundromat paid $190. Her room cost $900 a month, and the rent was already 8 days late. She stood there calculating it again and again, and there was no way to reach a different answer. That night, when she returned to the row house in Olneyville shortly before 11 o'clock, a car was parked across the street, about 20 meters from the entrance, beneath the streetlight that had been broken since summer. The car was gray and didn't belong to anyone in the building. Its lights were off, but as she passed, she saw someone sitting inside. She didn't turn her head. She walked straight in, climbed the stairs, locked the door, and stood with her back against it for a long time. Tobias had been asleep since 9 o'clock. The following night, the car was there again, in the same place, at the same distance. Delphine didn't turn on the light in the front room. She sat in the plastic chair beside the window, pulled the curtain open by roughly the width of 2 finger joints, and looked down. The car remained there until 2 o'clock in the morning, then drove away. She stayed in that chair until dawn, and during those hours she took out her phone and composed a message to Maren Voss. She wrote it very slowly, deleting and rewriting it 4 times. The final version said that she was deeply sorry, that she had thought carefully, that she was only a cleaner and wasn't capable of carrying something like this, that she hoped the attorney would understand her circumstances, and that she wished to withdraw her agreement to testify. She read the message 3 times. Her thumb rested over the send button. She didn't press it. She placed the phone face down on her lap and watched the window until the sky began to brighten. At 7 o'clock, Tobias woke and ran out of the bedroom carrying something in both hands that he had hidden beneath the bed for 3 days. "Look at this," he said. It was a papier-mâché model of the solar system. 8 spheres of different sizes threaded onto toothpicks planted in a piece of cardboard painted dark blue, with the largest yellow sphere in the center, and several orange paper rays glued around it. He placed it on the dining table, turned the cardboard so she could see it from above, and began to explain. He pointed to the 6th sphere from the center, the only one with a circular paper ring passing around it. "This is Saturn," he said. "The ring isn't one solid thing. People think it's a single flat disk, but it isn't. It's billions of pieces of ice and rock flying around it, some as big as a house, some as small as a grain of sand." He had cut the paper ring with scissors, and its edge was slightly ragged. He pointed to the uneven place and said he had done it on purpose to make it look real, because if he cut it too perfectly round, it would be wrong. Delphine sat in the chair opposite him and listened. Tobias spoke for 8 uninterrupted minutes. He explained why the ring was so thin that if Saturn were reduced to the size of a dinner plate, the ring would be thinner than a sheet of paper. He said the ring wouldn't last forever, that in several 100 million years it would all fall into the planet and disappear, and he said it with genuine sadness, as though it were something that would happen the following week. Then he looked up and asked whether she thought it was beautiful. Delphine looked at his face, at his hands still sticky with glue, at the paper ring cut slightly crooked, and told him it was beautiful, more beautiful than the one in the book. Tobias grinned, picked up the model, and carried it back into the bedroom, warning her as he went not to touch it because the glue wasn't completely dry. Delphine remained alone at the dining table. She turned her phone over. She opened the message she had written the night before, the 12-line message she had composed and rewritten 4 times, and read it one final time. Then she pressed and held the screen and deleted everything. She sat in silence for roughly half a minute, staring at the empty screen. Then she called Maren Voss. Voss answered after 2 rings. Delphine said her shift at the county building had been taken away. She said a car had been parked outside her home for 2 nights in a row. She spoke calmly, without crying, without pleading, simply listing each fact as though reading from a page. Then she said the final thing, that she would still testify, and that if necessary, she would sign any document they placed before her. Voss was silent for a moment, then asked whether she was certain. Delphine said she wasn't certain at all, but she had thought it through. 2 hours later, Raymond called her back. He didn't ask whether she was afraid. He didn't thank her. He only said that beginning that afternoon, his people would remain near where she lived, that they wouldn't disturb her, and that she didn't need to see them. Then he added that Attorney Voss would arrange another place for her to stay if she wanted, and that she should leave this month's rent alone and not worry about it. Delphine said she wouldn't accept money. Raymond didn't argue. He said only one sentence before ending the call, and it was the only promise he made to her in this entire story. You won't have to stand alone. At 6 o'clock on Tuesday morning, 3 vehicles parked outside the county police headquarters on Pontiac Street, and Arden Wolf entered the lobby with 4 federal investigators and a man carrying 2 empty document boxes. He handed the warrant to the officer on duty and demanded that the police chief, the sergeant who had been on night duty on October 11th, and the officer who had made the arrest be summoned. 40 minutes later, 6 people were seated in the conference room on the 2nd floor, the door closed and the blinds drawn. The police chief sat at the head of the table, with his hands clasped together. Hollis Drake sat to his left, his face gray, his eyes fixed on the tabletop. Warren Blackwood sat across from him, leaning back in his chair with one leg crossed over the other, and it was the posture of a man who wanted everyone in the room to see that he had nothing to fear. Wolf didn't sit. He stood at the opposite end of the table, opened his briefcase, and removed 3 things. He placed the first one down. This is the activity log for the body-worn recording device assigned to Officer Blackwood, he said. We obtained it directly from the manufacturer's server, without going through your technical department. This log records every time the device was turned on, turned off, charged, and synchronized, and it can't be altered by the user. He pushed the sheet of paper into the center of the table. On the night of October 11th, this device was turned off at 2:03 in the morning. It was turned back on at 2:31. The status recorded in the log is manual shutdown. Not a dead battery, not a hardware failure, not a lost connection. Someone picked it up and held down the power button for 3 seconds. He placed the second item down. This is the operating log for the industrial paper shredder located in the record storage area of the county administration building, he said. This model records its startup time and total running time because those details are connected to the warranty. On the night of October 12th, the machine started at 3:31 in the morning and ran intermittently for 14 minutes. During the entire month of October, this was the only time it operated outside business hours. He pushed the second sheet beside the first. That same night, the basement corridor lighting was cut at the breaker box beginning at 2:50 in the morning, and the hallway camera recorded nothing because it was connected to the same electrical circuit. Whoever did this knew the building's electrical layout. Blackwood didn't move, but Drake raised a hand and loosened his collar. Wolf placed the third item on the table. He didn't push it forward, he simply left it there. A large sheet of paper yellowed around the edges and sealed inside a clear plastic sleeve. And this, he said, is one page recovered from the floor of the record storage area in the early hours of October 12th, after the paper shredder stopped running. It had fallen beneath a cabinet in the 4th row, where labor-related case files from 1990 through 2000 were stored. We compared the archive code in the upper left corner with the county intake ledger. The file containing this page was placed into storage in May of 1996 and was reported missing on October 12th of this year. He looked around the table. In other words, gentlemen, the file was reported missing on the very morning after the shredder ran for 14 minutes. The police chief closed his eyes. Blackwood finally spoke. He gave a quiet laugh through his nose and said that machine logs could prove a machine had run, but they couldn't prove who had been standing beside it. That dozens of people entered and left that basement every day, and that if the federal government intended to build a case around a sheet of paper found beneath a cabinet, then he advised them to hire themselves a proper lawyer. We have a witness, Wolf said. Blackwood shrugged. Who? At that moment, the door opened. Raymond Falcone walked in alone, without handcuffs, wearing a black coat, and he crossed to the empty chair at the end of the table and sat down without greeting anyone. Blackwood looked at him. Then he leaned back and laughed, this time aloud, and the sound rang clearly through the silent room. So that's it, he said. He turned toward Wolf. You sit here wearing federal badges, and you intend to rely on the word of a mafia thug. No one in the room answered. Blackwood pointed at Raymond. Do you know who this man is? He said to Wolf. Do you know how he made his money for the past 15 years? He turned toward the police chief, then back again. Everyone in this building knows. Everyone in this city knows. Half the people who watched the recording that old woman posted know too. Go down there and read the comments. And now I'm supposed to sit here and listen to a man like this accuse me. Raymond didn't react while he spoke. He sat still with both hands resting on the table, and he waited until the final sentence had fallen and disappeared into the air. Only then did he speak. His voice was very quiet, so quiet that the man seated at the opposite end of the table had to lean forward. And Drake had to raise his head for the first time since entering the room. "You thought I stayed on my knees because I couldn't stand," Raymond said. Blackwood fell silent. "That night, I could have spoken 3 names," Raymond continued. "And within 20 minutes, you would have been standing at attention, explaining yourself to your own people. I have an attorney available by phone 24 hours a day. I have enough money to leave that holding cell before you finish typing your report." I did nothing. I knelt. I stayed silent. "I let you write." He paused for 1 beat. "I stayed on my knees because I needed you to believe I couldn't stand. Because as long as you believed that, you would keep going. And you did. The following night, you went into the basement." Blackwood opened his mouth, but no words came out. "You say I'm not clean?" Raymond said. "You're right. I'm not clean. I've done things that, if I were sitting on the other side of this table, I would prosecute myself for. I didn't come here to argue about that, and I'm not asking anyone to believe me." He looked directly into the deputy sheriff's face. "But I have never put on a uniform, stood before a stranger, and told them I was there to protect them." The room fell completely silent. Wolf placed his hand on the plastic sleeve containing the paper and pushed it into the center of the table, directly in front of Hollis Drake. "Before we continue," he said, "I want Sergeant Drake to look at the signature box at the bottom of this page and confirm something for me." Hollis Drake looked down at the sheet of paper inside the plastic sleeve. He stared at it for a very long time, longer than a man should need to recognize his own signature, and throughout that silence, no one in the room spoke. Then he raised both hands to his face and dragged his palms from his forehead down to his chin, exactly as he had done in the duty room at 4:20 in the morning on October 12th, and when he lowered them, his eyes were red. "It's mine," he said. Wolf asked whether he wanted a lawyer before continuing. Drake shook his head. "It's been 30 years, he said. "I've been waiting for this for 30 years. Blackwood turned sharply toward him. "Hollis, don't say anything." But Drake didn't look at him. He looked at Raymond Falcone seated at the end of the table, and he began to tell the story. He said that in 1996, he was 27 years old, had been on the force for 3 years, and worked extra hours as a safety supervisor for a subcontractor at the Harris Street construction site, the kind of work many young officers in the county accepted back then to earn additional money. He said his job was to walk the site every morning, sign a form, and receive $120 each time he signed. He said that on the morning of April 11th, he made that inspection and saw that the base of the scaffolding along the eastern row had sunk after 3 days of rain. He said he wrote it on the form. He said he told the site foreman. Wolf asked who the site foreman was. Drake remained silent for several seconds. Then he gave a name. Then he turned his head to the left, looked directly at Warren Blackwood, and repeated that name more slowly. Blackwood shot to his feet. The chair behind him tipped sideways and struck the wall. He said only 2 words. "Shut up." His voice broke on the second. A federal investigator stood. The police chief said quietly, "Warren, sit down." Blackwood didn't sit. He remained standing with both arms hanging at his sides, and Drake continued. He said that when he reported the problem, the foreman told him the contract carried a delay penalty, that every lost day cost $4,000, that the sunken section only needed another plank beneath it, and that he should sign because everything would be fine. Drake said he signed. He said he collected his $120 that day, just as he always did, then went home and ate dinner with his wife. He said that the following day, April 12th, at 12 minutes past 4 in the afternoon, the eastern row of scaffolding collapsed. No one in the conference room moved. Raymond Falcone sat perfectly still, both hands still resting on the table, and he never took his eyes off Drake. Drake continued. He said that during the next 3 days, meetings were held to which he wasn't invited. He said that when the final report was prepared, it recorded 1 victim, a worker who had climbed into an unapproved area against instructions. He said the other 6 families were paid directly by the subcontractor, outside the official record, each receiving a settlement accompanied by a release. He said most of those 6 families were immigrants, that 2 lacked valid documentation, and that not one of them asked a single question afterward. He said the form he had signed on April 11th, the form containing his warning about the sunken scaffolding base, was removed from the file before it was submitted to the county. and a clean version was substituted. He said he knew, and he remained silent. Wolf asked why. Drake said because he had been 27 years old. His wife had just given birth to their first child, and he was told that if he opened his mouth, the first person prosecuted would be the man whose signature appeared on the form. After saying that, he fell silent. Then he added something no one had asked. 3 months later, he said, the site foreman died. Drake looked down at the table. The official record called it an accident. But everyone in the county knew he had taken his own life, crushed by the guilt of what he had allowed to happen. He left behind a wife and an 18-year-old son who had just applied to the police academy. Every face in the room turned toward Warren Blackwood. He was still standing. There was no color left in his face, and his right hand gripped the back of the tilted chair as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. He didn't deny it. He didn't say a word. Wolf asked whether he wished to make a statement. Blackwood opened his mouth, and all that came out was a short sentence directed toward the floor rather than anyone in the room. He wasn't that kind of man. No one answered. He repeated it, slightly louder. My father wasn't that kind of man. He did that work for 30 years and never let anyone get hurt. Then he dropped heavily into the chair beside him, bent forward, rested both elbows on his knees, and remained that way. Wolf turned to a fresh page in his notebook and said calmly that he needed to clarify one point for the record. He asked when Blackwood first learned what was inside the file stored in the 4th row. Blackwood didn't look up. He gave 4 words. Since I was 22. He said he had read it when he was 22, during the first 6 months of his career, when he had been assigned to organize the archives, and that from that day forward, he knew exactly which drawer held it. Wolf asked what he had done with it during the 24 years that followed. Blackwood said he had done nothing. He had simply left it there. He said no one had ever asked about it, no one had ever filed a petition, no one had ever called, and he had believed no one ever would. Until 3 weeks earlier. Raymond Falcone listened to all of it. Then he did something that drew the attention of everyone in the room, though it was a very small thing. He pulled back his left sleeve, removed the white-faced watch from his wrist, and placed it on the table with the face turned upward. He pushed it forward about the length of his hand. The 2 hands remained frozen at 12 minutes past 4. This belonged to my father, he said. It stopped at 4:12 in the afternoon on April 12th, 1996. I've kept it since I was 16. Blackwood raised his head and looked at the watch. You and I lost our fathers in the same spring, Raymond said. You lost yours 3 months after I lost mine. Both of us grew up inside a story someone else had written for us. He looked at the deputy sheriff for a long time before speaking the final sentence. You and I are more alike than you think, he said. The only difference is that I wanted to know the truth. You were afraid of it. Warren Blackwood was stripped of his badge and weapon inside that conference room, in front of 6 people, at 7:20 in the morning. The police chief was the one who held out his hand to receive them, and he did it without saying a word. Blackwood placed the badge on the table instead of handing it over, and when the metal touched the wood, a very soft sound passed through the silent room, a small, clean click, no louder than someone setting down a key. He was escorted out through the rear entrance. 3 floors below, at the end of the ground floor hallway, a 24-year-old officer named Elias Pratt stood before a door marked Internal Affairs, and he had been standing there for 9 minutes without knocking. He had stood in places like that many times during the previous 2 weeks. Twice, he had written a letter and deleted it. Once, he had sat in his car outside his mother's house for 40 minutes without going inside. What had kept him awake for 14 nights wasn't the sound of breaking glass, though it returned to his mind every time he closed his eyes. It wasn't the grinding of metal when the patrol car reversed either. What haunted him was a silence that lasted about 3 seconds on the wet road when the handcuffed man turned his head to the right and looked directly at him, and Elias stood 8 paces away with enough time to say one sentence, any sentence at all, and he said nothing. He only raised a hand to the back of his neck, let it fall, and looked away first. Elias Pratt knocked on the door. He remained inside for 3 hours and 40 minutes, and recounted the entire night of October 11th in sequence, from the moment he received the request for assistance until the patrol car left the scene. He stated that the man under arrest hadn't resisted at any point. He stated that the man's vehicle had been in park and hadn't moved. He stated that he had seen the indicator light on his superior officer's body-worn camera in the off position before they stepped out of the patrol car. When asked why he had waited until that day to give his statement, Elias Pratt said he had no answer that sounded respectable, that he had been afraid of losing his job, and that for 2 weeks he had kept telling himself it wasn't his part to deal with. Then he added one sentence, that the person taking the statement recorded word for word in the file. He said that some mornings he woke believing he had only been standing there, but standing there was also something a person chose to do. That same afternoon, in Elmwood, a man in a suit rang Ruth Ann Collier's doorbell and handed her an envelope. She invited him inside, but he politely declined, saying he had only been instructed to deliver the letter. Ruth Ann carried the envelope into the kitchen, sat in the same chair where she had spent the morning after posting the recording, and put on her glasses to read. The letter was brief. It said that the footage she had provided had been authenticated and was being used as evidence in an ongoing federal investigation. It thanked her for voluntarily preserving and publishing the material. It said someone would contact her to take a formal statement. Ruth Ann read the letter 3 times. Then she placed it on the table, removed her glasses, and sat looking out at the backyard, where the bird feeder her husband had built 20 years earlier still stood. Alone in the empty kitchen, she said aloud the exact words she had been thinking all morning. "I didn't do anything. I only pressed the button." 3 days later, when a reporter in the lobby of the federal building asked Raymond Falcone what he wanted to say to the woman who had recorded the footage, he stopped and answered in exactly 2 sentences. He said that 6 people had been standing across the street that night, and every one of them had a phone. Then he said that she pressed record while the entire city pressed the accelerator. The following day, the federal prosecutor's office formally announced that it was reopening the investigation into the scaffolding collapse at the Harris Street construction site on April 12, 1996. The announcement was 9 lines long and contained no adjectives, but the 4th line held a phrase that every local newspaper printed in bold when republishing it. A phrase stating that the number of victims recorded in the original file might not fully reflect what had occurred. Then the calls began. It took 11 days to locate the remaining 6 families, because the addresses in the files were 30 years old, because 3 families had moved out of state, and because 1 family had no one left, but 5 were found. An 84-year-old woman in Fall River listened in silence for so long that the caller thought the line had gone dead, then asked one question: "Did you just say my husband's name?" A 53-year-old man in Worcester, the son of the person listed on the 2nd line, said after hearing the news that he had written to the county 3 times, in 2001, 2003, and 2006, and had never received a response, and that he still kept copies of all 3 letters inside a shoebox. A woman in Providence, the daughter of the person named on the 7th line, said that for 30 years her family had believed her father died because he entered a restricted area without permission, and that she had grown up hearing people say he had been careless. She asked the caller whether the record would now be corrected. The caller said yes. She said thank you, then asked to end the call, and she hung up very quickly. 11 months later, Warren Blackwood received a federal prison sentence after accepting a plea agreement on 3 groups of charges, including destruction of evidence in a matter under review, making false statements in an official document, and violating a citizen's civil rights under the authority of law. He would never work in law enforcement again. Hollis Drake was charged with offenses related to concealing workplace deaths and falsifying records, and he was the only person in the entire case who didn't hire a trial attorney but admitted everything at the very first hearing. When the judge asked whether he wished to say anything before sentencing, he stood and said that at 27 years old he had signed his name once, and for 30 years he had paid for that signature by never daring to look directly into the faces of anyone from those 6 families, and that the sentence he was receiving that day was far gentler than what he had said to himself every night. The county police department entered into a 4-year independent oversight agreement, with provisions requiring audits of recording equipment, new records, storage procedures, and a civilian review board with the authority to examine complaints, instead of allowing them to remain untouched inside filing cabinets. The 1996 case was formally revised. All 7 names were fully entered into the official record, and all 7 families received compensation. Raymond Falcone transferred his entire share to the other 6 families, divided equally, keeping none of it for himself, and he asked that the gesture not be made public. But the woman in Providence, the daughter of the man listed on the 7th line, revealed it herself during an interview. That same year, Raymond completed his agreement with the federal government. He didn't go to prison, but he lost most of his assets. 3 companies were dissolved, 2 properties were seized, and he was placed under supervision for 5 years with regular reporting requirements. Maren Voss told him she could fight to reduce the terms. He said there was no need. He said that after demanding that others pay the price for a signature written in 1996, he couldn't sit there and bargain over the price of what he himself had done. The Maybach remained in the garage of a warehouse near the harbor, its front end crushed, its windshield temporarily replaced with a sheet of plastic. Someone asked why he didn't have it repaired. He said some things should exist only once. Delphine Archer never returned to the county administration building. 6 months after giving her testimony, she accepted a job managing records at a nonprofit legal organization that helped workers who couldn't afford attorneys, and she worked there during the day while attending classes 3 nights a week. The person interviewing her that day asked only one question: why she believed she was suited for work involving the organization and preservation of records. She answered that she had once held a sheet of paper without understanding a single word on it, and that paper had changed the lives of 6 families, so she understood very clearly why no piece of paper could ever be allowed to disappear. On a Saturday afternoon, near the end of autumn, 3 people sat inside the Science Center by the bay, in the domed room where the sky was projected across the ceiling. The lights slowly dimmed, the ceiling brightened, and the planets began turning gently overhead. Tobias, 10 years old, leaned all the way back in his seat with his face turned upward, and when Saturn drifted past with its rings tilted at a clear angle, the boy laughed aloud and turned toward his sister, saying, "See, the ring really isn't solid. I told you." His laughter echoed through the dark room, and several people in the row ahead turned around and smiled with him. Delphine sat beside him, and Raymond sat in the outermost seat. When the presentation ended and the lights came back on, Raymond pulled up his left sleeve, removed the white-faced watch from his wrist, and held it out to Delphine. She didn't accept it immediately. She looked at him. He placed it in her palm and closed her fingers around it. "It stopped at 12 minutes past 4, he said. "I kept it for 30 years so I wouldn't forget. I don't need to remember anymore, because the whole city knows now." Delphine opened her hand and looked at the ivory-colored face, the 2 motionless hands, and the steel rim worn smooth where it had rested against a person's wrist. She was about to say something when Tobias ran over, rested both elbows on the back of the seat, and peered into his sister's palm. "Does it work?" he asked. Raymond looked at him and smiled, and it was the first genuine smile he had given in this entire story. "No," he said, "but it has finished the work it was meant to do." This story reminds us of something very simple, that the truth doesn't need a hero. It only needs one person who refuses to look away. A 71-year-old woman merely pressed a button. A young woman working the night shift merely bent down and picked up a sheet of paper she couldn't understand. A young police officer merely spoke aloud what he had seen, 2 weeks late, but still in time. 3 very small acts, carried out by 3 very ordinary people, and together they uncovered what power and money had buried for nearly 30 years. The story also reminds us that human beings can rarely be divided neatly into the good and the bad. Raymond Falcone wasn't a good man, and he never claimed to be one, but he made the right choice at the right moment, and he paid the price for what he had done without bargaining. Warren Blackwood wasn't born as the man he became. He was simply so afraid of the truth about his father that he buried the truth belonging to 6 other families, and when that fear was allowed to grow long enough, it became a crime. Hollis Drake signed his name once at 27 years old to preserve his job and the roof over his family's head, and he carried that signature through the rest of his life. Silence always has a price, and almost always, someone else is forced to pay it. In the end, a person's dignity isn't found in the car they drive, the house they live in, or the name people whisper behind their back. It is found in the way they rise after being forced to their knees, and in whether they remember those who are still kneeling. If today's story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video, so that each day you'll have more meaningful stories to listen to. How did this story make you feel? And which person stayed in your mind the most? We would truly love to read your thoughts in the comments below, because the feelings that come from the deepest part of your heart will always be the most precious thing to us. We wish every one of you watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.